of religion. Okay. And then next, okay, when we look at this as well, we see that some rulers are going to start to challenge the authority, okay, of the church itself. They challenge the political power that those churches might have had. Also, when we see this, Germany is going to be divided into a bunch of different competing states. So it's hard for the Pope or even the Holy Roman Emperor to really impose any kind of central authority. Merchants are going to rise to power here as well within this. So the merchants here resent paying the church taxes to Rome here as well. And then spurred on by all these social, political, and economic forces, a new government is going to be brought into Germany. So if we look at this chart here, the causes of the Reformation, we can see the social aspect, valuing humanism and secularism. The printing press, guys, we can't underestimate the power of the printed word and the idea that it becomes cheaper and more readily available, and therefore it becomes critical for to spread the ideals that are critical to the church. Political, powerful monarchs who are going to challenge the church. We'll talk about one of them today. Many leaders view the Pope as a rather foreign ruler and tries to challenge that authority. European princes and kings are jealous of the wealth that the church has because the church is probably the most powerful entity in the world at this point in time. And then we look at religious aspects, the church leaders being corrupt. And many people found that the church practices like the sale of indulgences is unacceptable. And we'll talk more and more about this as we go. So the popes that ruled during the Renaissance patronized artists. They spend extravagantly all throughout the world on personal pleasure. They go out and fight wars in order to advance Catholicism, but really advancing themselves. Some popes are even going to admit to fathering children during this time. And they are pursuing kind of worldly ideals. The priests and monks are very poorly educated. They couldn't read, let alone teach what they were reading. And priests are breaking their vows. They marry, they drink to excess, they gamble, all things that are viewed upon not as a true church leader. And so you start to see some people turn away from that because of the fact that these members of the church are supposed to be the guides for morality. You start to see people change in that. Two people are really going to try to reform the church. John Wycliffe of England and Jan Hus from Bohemia. Wycliffe is going to come out and advocate church reform, denied that the Pope had any kind of right to worldly power, and they teach that the Bible had more authority than the church itself, than the church leaders. You were supposed to go by what the Bible states as opposed to what the church authority did. So you start to see the people break away from this. And this won't be the first person to really say, hey, the Bible should be the power of the church. It is what is written. Everything else is just things that are going to be interpreted by church leaders, some of which we know are poorly educated. They can't even read. So those are some of the criticisms that take place from the Catholic Church. And so Martin Luther comes to the forefront. At the age of 21, Luther is caught in a terrible thunderstorm. He's convinced that he's going to die, and he prays to Saint Anne to help him. Even after entering the monastery, Luther felt fearful, he felt lost, he felt sinful, and that he was actually going to be rejected by God himself. So he constantly is confessing his sins. He's fasting, he's doing penance, but he's studying the Bible this entire time while he's in the monastery. And Luther comes to the conclusion that faith alone is the key to salvation. Okay? And so Luther is a monk, and he's a teacher at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony in Germany. And he's very unhappy with a friar by the name of Johann Tetzel. And Tetzel was selling indulgences, which is basically a pardon of your sins. People were paying Tetzel, and he would give them their pardons from sin. And so what it did was really release the sinner from performing the penalty that a priest imposed for those sins. So if you're buying an indulgence, you are therefore buying your way into heaven, according to what those were. And Luther comes out and writes his 95 Theses. They are formal statements, that attack the pardon merchants within the church. And he pins them to the castle wall at the castle church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. Someone takes Luther's words and copies them and takes them to a printer. And so Luther becomes widely known all across Germany. And his actions are going to begin what's known as the Reformation. Okay? It's really a movement in religious reform. It's going to lead to the founding of many other Christian churches that don't accept the Pope's authority here. So here we see Luther there, obviously on the left. It's a depiction of him, a painting, and this is the depiction of Luther pinning his 95 Theses on the castle church door. So Luther is not at all trying to change the Catholic Church at this point in time. He's actually just trying to reform it. His teachings are going to be based off of three main ideas. You can win salvation only by faith in God's gifts of forgiveness. The church taught that faith and good works were needed, that you needed to go out and show your good works to the church and to the people. He also taught that all church teaching should be clearly based on the words of the Bible. Both the Pope and church traditions are going to be very false authorities. So you needed the words of the Bible, according to Luther, and nothing else. As Catholics, we do understand that there are church traditions that we do follow as well, if you are Catholic. And then all people of faith were equal, okay, and therefore did not need priests to interpret the Bible for them. That is something that is not going to be accepted very well by the rulers, or by the Pope, and by the leaders of the church itself, the Catholic Church. So the response to Luther. Luther's actually very surprised at how fast his ideas kind of go out there. Initially, the church officials in Rome view Luther as just this kind of rebellious monk who really doesn't have much to go on. Probably needs to be punished by his superiors, but that's it. But as Luther's ideas become more and more popular, the Pope realizes that he's actually a serious threat. And so Luther had suggested that the Christians drive the Pope from the church by force. In doing so, this leads to Pope Leo X to issue a decree that would threaten excommunication of Luther unless he took back his statements or recanted his statements, to take them back. Luther doesn't recant his statements, and the Pope excommunicates him from the Catholic Church. Now, nowadays, we would look at this and say, wow, big deal, the Pope excommunicated me. Back then, not being a figure of religion would have been something that would have been terribly wrong. And people would be very outspoken against that. The Holy Roman Emperor, who is in charge of all of Rome's teachings and areas at that point in time, opposes Luther's teachings, but he controls all of the German states. So he summons Luther to the town of Worms in 1521 to stand trial. He's told to recant and take back his statements, and Luther refuses. And he says this: I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not retract anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. I cannot do otherwise. Here I stand. May God help me. Amen. That was his statement at the Edict of Worms. And so Charles issues this Edict of Worms, and it declares that Luther. Aiden, can you turn that off, please?
Oh, my bad.
Thank you. It declares that Luther is an outlaw and a heretic. He's not to be given food or shelter. All of his books are to be burned, and so on. Prince Frederick, however, from Saxony, disobeys the emperor, and he actually will go out and for a year after the trial shelters Luther in one of his castles. And while there, Luther will translate the one of the Bibles into German. Luther is going to return to Wittenberg in 1522, and there discovers that many of his ideas are already being put into practice. So instead of continuing to seek reform within the Catholic Church, Luther decides that he and his followers will begin their own separate religious group known as Lutherans. And so this is where we get the first religion that comes out of what is called Protestantism. So the Protestant religions, they're not necessarily just one religion. They exist with many different types of religions. So the peasant revolt, some kind of begin to apply Luther's revolutionary ideas to society. And in 1524, the German princes, who are very excited by the reformers' talk of the Christian freedom, they demand an end to serfdom. And so you have bands of angry peasants that go about the countryside, raiding monasteries, pillaging, anything they can do to go about this and change their ideals. They seize church property and assert their independence from Charles V. In 1529, the German princes who are loyal to the Pope join forces against Luther. Okay? Those princes who supported Luther signed a protest against that agreement. And the protesting princess becomes known as the Protestants. Okay, those are the groups who are protesting, who are against the Pope and for Luther. And in 1547, we see the Protestant princes are defeated, but they are not going to be able to be drawn back to the Catholic Church. And so we see what's written is known as the Peace of Augsburg. In 1555, Charles is weary of that fighting. He assembles everybody in the city of Augsburg, and the princes all agree that you could, each ruler could decide which religion of his state they would have. And it becomes known as the Peace of Augsburg there. This is Protestantism, so it's a branch of Christianity developed out of the Reformation during this time. It has three very distinct branches that emerge: Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and Calvinism. Those are the three. Luther obviously has Lutheranism is based on the teachings of Luther. Calvinism is based on the teaching of a man named John Calvin. And then Anglicanism, which is established by King Henry VIII. And we'll talk a little bit more about him. But you can see Anglicanism there and how it breaks down Episcopalian, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal. And then in Calvinism, Presbyterian and Reformed. But Lutheranism remains the same. So when we look at these, you could see there too, with the religious practices and where they kind of stand within those groups. Interpretations of the Bible, so on and so forth. This could be something that you see on your test, so just make sure you guys are being aware of this. You can find it in your book as well. So this is where history gets interesting to me. Henry VIII is one of the most fascinating characters in history, in my opinion, because of what he goes through. So Henry VIII is married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. But Henry VIII wants a son to be his heir to the throne. He has a daughter. The daughter's name is Mary. But he wants there to be a son because at this point in time, female rulers had not done well in history. And England was Catholic for the most part. As a matter of fact, Henry VIII even supported putting down Luther in many ways. So he and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, have their daughter, Mary. But Henry's convinced that his 42-year-old wife would have no more children. So he asks the Pope to annul the marriage, which is basically get rid of the marriage, turn it down. And the Pope does not do so. Under most circumstances, the Pope probably would have. However, Catherine's nephew happens to be Charles V, and Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Emperor protects all of the lands and runs all of the lands under the Pope. So Henry does not get what he wants here in this by basically getting an annulment from the Pope. So what does he do? Henry takes steps to solve his own marriage problem. In 1529, he calls together what is known as the Reformation Parliament. Okay? It's to pass a set of laws that would end the Pope's power in England. That was his goal. The Parliament becomes known as the Reformation Parliament. In 1533, Henry secretly marries a woman by the name of Anne Boleyn. Shortly after that, Boleyn is in her, at that point in time, is in her 20s. Henry is, I can't remember how old Henry was at this point in time. I'd have to look. Anyway, he marries Anne Boleyn, who's in her 20s. And shortly after that, Parliament legalizes Henry's divorce from Catherine. And in 1534, Henry decides, I'm going to break with the Pope and completely, it breaks with the Pope, and Parliament approves something called the Act of Supremacy. It called for people to take an oath recognizing the divorce and accepting Henry as the head of England's church, which in this case was Anglicanism. If you guys remember, we talked about, I believe in section 1, a man by the name of Thomas More. Thomas More doesn't like this move. He's a devout Catholic. He has his own issues with the Catholic Church, but he is very much upset that his friend, Henry VIII, thought that he could do this. Henry actually has him arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, and eventually he will be executed. He refuses to take the oath, does not accept the terms, and he is burned at the stake at that point in time. So Henry is an interesting character. So we look at the consequences of Henry's changes. Henry doesn't immediately get the heir he sought. Anne Boleyn, his wife, is going to give birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. She eventually falls out of favor with Henry. She's charged with treason. She too is put in the Tower of London, which was the prison, and she is beheaded in 1536. Henry then takes another wife, a third wife, a woman by the name of Jane Seymour, in 1537. And she gives him his long-awaited son that he's wanted, Edward. Jane dies 2 weeks later. And it's actually a really sad point in time for Henry. He actually truly loved Jane more than anything else. It ends up being just a sad point in his life. Henry marries 3 more times, none of those marriages producing any of his children. And over time, I believe he marries, let's see here. So he marries Jane. Then in 1540, he divorces Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, executes Catherine Howard, who was his 5th wife, and marries Catherine Parr, his 6th wife. She will outlive him, though. And Edward V begins a 6-year rule at the age of 9, beginning at the age of 9 years old. He was too young to rule and constantly ill. He eventually dies 6 years after he takes the throne. So Henry's first daughter, Mary, will come to the throne in 1553. The problem with Mary is that people are already now Anglican in so many ways. And she takes the church and tries to return it to Catholicism. And it causes a lot of problems. Eventually, she too passes, and she dies in 1558. So we see now we've gone through Edward, who was his last son, goes then to his first daughter, Mary, and now it brings to the throne Elizabeth I. This is the line that is known as the Tudor line, Tudor. And the Tudors are this group of people who are the family of Henry VIII who rules. And Elizabeth will be the last in line. She is Anne Boleyn's daughter. Um, and she comes to power and takes the throne following the death of Mary. She restores Protestantism to England and sets up the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, there. She also establishes a church state that's moderate Catholics and moderate Protestants could both accept and be happy with on both sides. And she has a lot of challenges that come her way. Catholics are always trying to overthrow Elizabeth. She can never quite get peace. Money is constantly a problem for her as well. She's also at this point in time trying to build an American empire early on. And so it just is a very difficult time for her. All right. So that is it for today.